Hi, Doug.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show. You are Douglas Osto. You're in New Zealand at Massey University, as I understand it, where you teach in the Asian Studies program. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm in Asian Studies and Philosophy now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And
So,
you've written a book called Altered States: Buddhism and Psychedelic Spirituality in America, published by Columbia University Press. Published this year by Columbia University Press, in fact.
yep, that's
Um,
right.
how are you liking the experience of having a book just out?
It's good. It's a relief to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite different from my first book. Obviously, it's drawing a lot more attention because my first book was my PhD on an ancient Indian Buddhist text, which tends to be pretty esoteric. So it's a new thing to get the kind of interest. Um, so yeah, I'm enjoying it. I'm kind of recovering from it, I guess.
Okay.
It was a big
Well,
project. It was about a 5-year project. I really put my guts into it. So it's kind of nice now to kick back and just now that it's out there.
well,
Yeah.
don't relax too deeply for the next 45, 50 minutes or so. Okay. We want
Okay. I've got coffee, so
we don't want
I'll do
Donald
some.
Trump to accuse you of
Just,
being low energy. Okay. So the book is, among other things, it's about something you're calling psychedelic Buddhism, right? And
yep.
what is psychedelic Buddhism?
Well, it's a term. I think it was first used by Eric Davis, and so I sort of picked up on that. He doesn't really elaborate on it, but it's a term I kind of picked up on as a kind of very loose definition of people who tend to mix their practice of Buddhism with the use of psychedelics in some way or another. And so it's a rather loosely defined spectrum of people that have sort of mixed and matched these two kind of spiritualities.
Okay. And
So,
as you note in the book, there's long been a connection that was known between psychedelic drugs and Buddhism, and the kind of the standard story was, well, in the 60s, some baby boomers took LSD or psilocybin or something and had experiences that in one way or another opened them up to Buddhist philosophy or Eastern philosophy broadly or meditation or something, but somehow or another, one thing led to another, and it's, I guess, commonly thought that the typical path to follow is then to drop the psychedelics. And in fact, I think a
hmm
whole lot of people did do that. And as you say in
hmm
the book, they think of themselves as maybe having graduated to a
Yep.
more kind of valid form of practice or something or other, a more mature form of practice or something. But anyway, you're here to tell us that that's not really the end of the story. There's some people who find value in continuing to do psychedelics as part of a meditative practice, I guess. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was one of the incentives to write the book is because that historical narrative that this was very time specific to the '60s was kind of covering up another story that really hadn't been told. And I was what first got me interested in it was the special edition from Tricycle on Buddhism and psychedelics that came out in
Right.
the mid
Tricycle is a
'90s.
Buddhist magazine, an American Buddhist magazine.
Yep, yep.
And
And
so what,
then
about
the
20
book that
years
came
ago?
out.
This was about 20 years
Uh,
ago they had this special edition, or a little less?
yeah, it was about mid '90. I think it was '95 that the special edition
Okay.
came out. And then the book Zigzag Zen, which is more or less, well, it more or less reproduced what was in that special edition of the Tricycle with some added material. But this kind of clued me into this idea that it was people were continuing to do this, and so I was interested in exploring that story
Hmm.
and sort of moving past this kind of rhetoric of okay, this was a '60s thing, and then we got on with our Buddhism. We got more serious about it. So
Okay. Now you are a practitioner of meditation, and in the
yes,
book you profess to have at least some experience with psychedelic drugs. So do
yeah.
you consider yourself a psychedelic Buddhist?
Yeah, that was interesting. I mean, I kind of in my postscript, I kind of say, well, according to my own definition, it kind of fits me into that category because I have had experience with psychedelics and got some benefit out of that, and also practice Buddhism. But at the same time, my caveat with that is that I'm not really an advocate of using psychoactive substances because I think they can be dangerous. So I'm not a proponent, but I actually have experimented. So I guess in that sense, yeah, I am. I'd be more on the kind of leaning more towards the conservative end of that. If there can be a conservative end of something that's more or less heterodox all by itself, but
so we can safely infer that at this moment you are not on LSD.
No, I'm currently.
That would be a less conservative way to approach the practice.
What I say is at the end in my postscript that my drug of choice really is coffee these days. Is what, and being a father of 4, it tends to be the most useful one for me to.
Oddly, I mean, I've actually found that coffee, if you're a serious coffee drinker, coffee in the morning can be conducive to good focus during meditation. I mean, I find I can't use it that way because I need to use it to actually get work done. But if I had the luxury of meditating right after my morning coffee, it would be a very solid session, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's how tea has been traditionally used in Chinese Buddhism as a stimulant to keep you awake. I mean, because anybody who's done any serious meditation knows that trying to stay awake on the cushion is sometimes a difficult task. So mild stimulant of tea and now coffee is it keeps you awake.
So you've done for the book. You did a certain amount of survey research of your own. You did online survey that included a lot of people who fall into the category of psychedelic Buddhists. Some who don't, but had maybe some experience with psychedelic substances. And then there's other survey data that you refer to that's useful, and we can get into all this. And you also follow, I think it's 5 specific psychedelic Buddhists, kind of up close. In the book, you do a kind of a closer take on them, and we can talk about all this. Yeah. But I wanted to ask you at the outset, what is it about psychedelic experience that leads people toward meditation or Eastern philosophy or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think that, they're personal reasons and then they're kind of social and cultural reasons. And I think, some of what happened in the 60s, some of that was kind of historical coincidence that, prior to the 60s, you kind of have this rationalistic worldview, scientific worldview, had kind of reached its apogee to the point where, the world was entirely disenchanted for a lot of people. And with the discovery of things like psilocybin and LSD, and the introduction of Eastern thought all happening at the same time, they kind of became associated with each other that way. And I think one of the things that we find in Buddhism and Hinduism in particular is a very advanced kind of culture of altered states of consciousness, which in the West, people have referred to kind of this Western scientific rationalistic worldview as being very monophasic, in the sense that our ordinary waking state of consciousness is really considered the only sort of valid one. Anything that diverges too much from that is considered to be, a symptom of psychosis or some kind of mental illness. And so people who have this profound altered state of consciousness, say through LSD or psilocybin, they may have been grasping for a way to understand sort of what's happened to them, a kind of trans-rational experience. And so I think that people then gravitated towards a kind of meditative system that we find in Buddhism as a way of trying to understand the experiences that they went through. I mean, and that's one idea, and I think that you can kind of situate that within the cultural milieu. I mean, obviously, it's more complicated than that, but I think that's one way that you can possibly usefully look at it.
Yeah. Well, you use the word disenchantment. In the book, you use the term re-enchantment, I think. And it's certainly, I mean, I've been on kind of 1 week meditation retreats, and it's certainly, I mean, especially I remember after the first one, there was a sense that the world was more enchanted than I would have thought of it as being. And just in the sense that there was more kind of like action and beauty in any given cubic inch of space. I mean, anything you looked at, right? Anything you looked at. If you walked up and looked at a tree or whatever, it just seemed to have more, you could say, kind of aesthetic vibrance or something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I talk about, I mean, these ideas of re-enchantment, disenchantment, it's really, there's a book that I use called The Re-Enchantment of the West that I refer to by Partridge, where he says that sort of re-enchantment is, disenchantment is a precursor to re-enchantment. So first you have the disenchanted world, and then it gets re-enchanted. And I think on an individual level, what happens is because we're constantly running these kind of conceptual programs and having these agendas, that when we can step out of that sort of default mode and actually experience things more immediately, which we can get through meditation, but also through psychedelics, it kind of has that effect. In a way, we kind of recapture that sort of innocence that children have, where it's that sense of wonder. It's that sense that the world is magical.
Right, like you'll see like a 1-year-old just kind of like staring at like a tennis ball, or like just starting to touch some surface and explore it. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a 1-year-old daughter, and she'll stop what she's doing sometimes, and she'll just look out the window because the wind's blowing, and so she'll be watching the leaves on the trees.
Right. Of course, a common reaction to seeing an adult do that is to say, "That guy's messed up." Right?
Yeah, which is a sad commentary.
Now, when you say re-enchantment, do you mean something more than what I said? I mean, I mean, a lot of people would take the word enchanted to mean there's something kind of supernatural infusing things with. I mean, is there that sense that you get from either meditative practice or psychedelics?
Well, that's tricky. I mean, it also depends on how you define supernatural. I mean, natural versus supernatural is a very kind of, sort of Western category of we put certain things, like things that happen in the physical world will categorize as natural, whereas things that have some kind of supernatural agency, such as divine or demonic, then go into the category of supernatural. So I don't know if re-enchantment can be easily kind of mapped onto that distinction, but it definitely, for some people, it does. I mean, again, with the 60s, there was a kind of spiritual eclecticism where, it was like astrology and tarot and magic and, a bit of Hinduism, a bit of Buddhism, a bit of Taoism. If you look at Ram Dass's Be Here Now, that just sort of captures this kind of zeitgeist where almost anything goes. But I don't think that re-enchantment necessarily implies a kind of a belief in the supernatural. But I think what it does imply is that it, in some sense, it goes beyond a kind of rationalistic and kind of mechanized view of the world. Mm-hmm. That there's something beyond what we ordinarily have access to as human beings, that somehow we can perhaps directly encounter.
Mm-hmm. So Aldous Huxley comes up in your book. I think of him because on the one hand, he wrote Doors of Perception, right, which was about this very thing, the use of psychedelics for insight or some sort of alteration of your perspective. But he was also an advocate of what he called the perennial philosophy, and the idea there was that all the different, the world's great religions and spiritual traditions, whatever you want to call them, and at their core have something kind of in common. And I think these two things were related. I assume that. I mean, I haven't read him that closely or in a long time, but I assume that during his psychedelic experience, he might have thought that sometimes he was more in touch with this common core of all spirituality or something, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This kind of perennialism and universalism is very much a part of the rhetoric of what you could call psychedelic spirituality, right from the time of Huxley. Huxley, he was a student. He was particularly a student of Advaita, but in the Doors of Perception, he draws on Advaita. He draws on Buddhism quite a bit.
Advaita being the kind of Hindu,
Hindu non-dual.
tradition.
Yeah. So he'll have an experience, like he describes an experience of flowers, say in the Doors of Perception, and he'll refer to this concept of Satchidananda in Advaita, which is just it's an experience of being, consciousness, bliss. And it's hard to know whether he's being poetic at points or whether he's actually literally trying to say that, because a complete experience of non-duality, there would be no subject-object occurring. So how could you experience a flower in a state of absolute pure consciousness? So, but there is not. But for him, he saw the mescaline, because what he tried was mescaline that he's writing about in the Doors of Perception. He saw mescaline as validating this kind of perennial philosophy for him, and it's one of the things that I talk about at some length when I look at in the chapter that I talk about. Are psychedelics the true Dharma, which is a kind of these debates that have gone on within kind of convert Buddhism and psychedelic spirituality.
Dharma being kind of the Buddhist teachings and also kind of the path you follow in response to the teachings.
Yes. So our psychedelic, in other words, what is the correct Buddhist response then to psychedelics? Is it really something that is can be integrated or cannot? And my answer is, I'm getting a software update. Let me just quit that. Is that it's an open question. It's not really answerable in the sense that people have different orientations towards Buddhism and their own particular worldview. But this idea that I think what I talk about in quite some length is this idea of set and setting. Mm-hmm. That a person's mindset and their particular cultural setting and physical setting, environmental setting, is going to determine to a great extent how they interpret their experience. But with any kind of experience, there's no tag that comes along that certifies the experience as authentic. So, and as soon as you start talking about any kind of experience, that interpretation is going to come into play. And in both psychedelic spirituality and in Buddhism, there's a kind of rhetoric of direct experience, right? That through meditation you can have direct experience that goes beyond the conceptual. And psychedelic spiritualists like Huxley and Leary and Alpert, they were saying that, psychedelics gives us direct access to reality. But then as soon as they begin to talk about it, they're bringing in their own their own biases, their own prejudices, their own beliefs, their own worldviews. And so
and in fact, it seems people can have wildly varying experiences on these substances. Mm-hmm. I think you mentioned Houston Smith. I think I recall a story about Houston Smith. I think he participated in these famous experiments at Harvard with psychedelics, right, or somewhere in the Harvard vicinity. And I think the story is that he was like going through the experience. He was, I guess, on LSD as part of the study, and these other guys were, and he kept. I think he I probably have this wrong, but somebody, I think him, he'd like walk up to someone and say, "So it's true, isn't it?" It's like he had this big insight, and his assumption was that everyone was sharing the same insight. And then later they talked afterwards, and the people he was saying, "So it's true, isn't it?" to weren't thinking anything like what he was thinking, right? And it seems to me, one of the things that, a number of drugs seem to be able to do is to kind of ratify whatever lend a kind of aura of validity to any number of things you may be thinking, right? Like this is the path, this is the truth. You know, that's not to say there's nothing interesting about what happens, and but it seems to me there is that complication that people have wildly different experiences on these. I mean, maybe I'm kind of rephrasing a question I asked earlier about what it is about psychedelic experience that inclines people toward Buddhism or meditation, and maybe the question is, what are some of the recurring themes that people get out of psychedelic experience that overlap with themes in Buddhism?
Yeah, I mean those are good questions, and again, it varies from person to person. I mean, one of the people I interviewed who's very involved in Zen, he said that in this idea of emptiness, that things lack inherent existence, for example, and that one of the things that he learned from his experience with psychedelics was that it demonstrated this fact to him. He realized how contingent his experience was on his own subjective frame, and that he was no longer quite so willing to take everything as face value as being objectively, real outside of himself.
So in other words, just to pause and flesh out this idea of emptiness. So like he was saying that, like, I guess he realized that whenever he had seen like a tree or a lamp, it had a kind of meaning to him that had informed his very perception of it and the way he kind of apprehended it. And he kind of realized now he was actually bringing something, he was kind of bringing a story to the perception. I mean, the meaning that these things had for him were not necessarily their intrinsic meaning. Is that?
Yeah, I think it was a kind of idea that that there's solidity as being, externally real, self-existent things, separate from him, was eroded through his experience of psychedelics. That's only just kind of one example, right, off the cuff. But I think that, people, I guess the things that people get from a Buddhist point of view will vary. I mean, sometimes they have insight into compassion, loving kindness, things like that. So I don't know if there's a quick answer to that. But I mean, getting back to what you're saying about Houston Smith, it was psilocybin that he was taking, and he was part of that whole Harvard psilocybin project, which Timothy Leary started up after he discovered magic mushrooms in the early '60s, and particularly it was a Good Friday. I think he tried them prior to that, but it was a Good Friday experiment then in Marsh Chapel, which really where he basically said that he had a direct encounter with God.
Houston Smith said this.
Yeah, about his experience in March, because he was actually one of the people that was supervising this experiment where divinity students on Good Friday in the basement of a chapel, some half were given psilocybin, half were given a placebo, and unsurprisingly, the ones that had the psilocybin tended to have a kind of spiritual experience. Houston Smith was one of those people, and he became a lifetime advocate of these substances in a much more moderate way than, say, somebody like Timothy Leary, who was quite kind of messianic about it. But one of the things that I mention in my book, that Pankey, who is the person that organized this as part of his PhD, this experiment, he fails to mention in his summary of the event is someone actually had a really bad time and actually had to be given Thorazine as a kind of sedative. So I think it comes back to what you were saying before, is that it's not really predictable. These substances. Sometimes I like to describe them in terms of extreme sports. There are people who like to go mountain climbing or cave diving or something like that, and that's fine. They can do that, but they also know that there are certain inherent risks that can occur. And even in the contemporary scientific studies, say that Johns Hopkins has been doing with psilocybin, where it's, everything is very carefully monitored and the exact dosages, and there's people there to hold your hand and make sure you're okay. Even some of those people have, bad experiences, or at least periods of fear and paranoia. So,
it's funny you should use that phrase, extreme sports, because I have, in describing like 1 week meditation retreats to people, I've sometimes said it's like extreme sports for the mind, and I do that by way of warning them that although I'm an advocate, and most people I know come out of them glad they went, there can be really extreme periods, uncomfortably intense periods during the course of a 1 week meditation retreat. So maybe that's another thing that the two have in common. Now you don't, here's a connection I might have suspected between the two, is that a big part of Buddhist philosophy, and something I think you come to appreciate on a meditation retreat, is that is just kind of the idea of how much the process of perception and apprehension is a process of construction, right?
Yes.
It gets back to what you were saying. It's kind of what the concept of emptiness is about, a recognition that some of the things you're attributing to the objects you see, including a certain kind of solidity or essence or something, is maybe something you're imposing on them. And, of course, it's true that, almost by definition, if you have an hallucination, one thing you're illustrating is that perception is a constructive process. Because you're constructing a whole set of perceptions that bear no correspondence to what seems to be in your actual environment. Now, on a meditation retreat, I've never hallucinated like that. That's not really the point. Although you can, during intense meditation, you can certainly see things, you can have images that are very vivid of things that aren't there and are kind of compelling and engrossing. But I would think that at a basic level there is this connection, just that both of these things illustrate in different ways how constructive perception is.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, the reason why I called it altered states was that there's no way you can understand psychedelics outside of the larger conversation about altered states of consciousness. And meditation definitely induces altered states of consciousness. My other area of interest, my original area of interest is early Mahayana Buddhism. And you read some of the early Mahayana sutras, and they're just completely filled with visionary experiences. And some contemporary psychedelic spiritualists have pointed this fact out, that like these sutras, these texts are actually psychedelic. And so a question that arose in my mind was, is this kind of superimposing your own kind of beliefs and cultural ideas onto these ancient texts, or is there really something that's something shared there? And I think that what's shared, what's in common, is these altered states of consciousness. And I think some of that is neurophysiological, that we are wired in such a way that under certain conditions, that where we alter our brain chemistry, we can change our perception, and we can hallucinate, and we can have profound altered states of consciousness. And this can come through meditation, and it can come through psychedelics. I mentioned in my book that I looked at, I did a survey of people who have done Vipassana, these 10-day Vipassana retreats. Mm-hmm. And about 100 people responded to the survey, and about 40% said they experienced some form of altered state of consciousness. And some of them maybe even full-blown, hallucinations. And so I think that the common denominator there, in some ways, is that that we can alter our chemistry in various ways and experience these profoundly altered states, and their meaning and how we integrate them into our lives is very dependent on individuals. Mm-hmm. But I think that is a common denominator, and I think that it's a little bit artificial to to draw a hard line between, say, someone who takes a dose of psilocybin versus someone who does intense meditation and fasting and sensory deprivation, and they both have visions, and to say, well, one's artificial, right, because they took a pill or they ate a mushroom, and the other one is more authentic because they sat in a cave and they only had one meal a day for a month or so, I think is a little bit forced, because in both cases we're manipulating our chemistry. So I think you do have a point there, and I do agree with you. I mean, anecdotally, there's somebody that I was friends with who was interested in meditation and wanted to do one of these retreats, a 10-day retreat, and when he came back, he was completely psychotic, and it took a few days and it took some some intervention. Luckily, he didn't have to be hospitalized, because people around him knew what was going on, and so with some medication to help his sleep return and getting back to normal eating patterns and sleeping patterns, rapidly he recovered. Mm-hmm. But under different conditions, he could have been hospitalized, heavily medicated, and it could have been, he could have become a casualty of the mental health system.
Now, there are these stories about meditation retreats. There's now a whole emerging literature on kind of dark nights of the soul and various people who may come out of these in worse shape than they went in. It can happen even if it's not the majority, the typical experience. So why don't you talk a little about what you've learned about this subculture you call psychedelic Buddhism, and what you've learned about kind of current practitioners, and tell me if I'm wrong. I mean, my sense of this is that the survey you did doesn't reliably tell us kind of what percentage of practitioners of Buddhism in America, say, are psychedelic Buddhists, because the survey, by its nature, maybe tended to attract people disproportionately who were interested in psychedelics. So I don't think the numbers tell us a lot about that. But as a look into this, it doesn't tell us much about the size of the subculture, I guess I'd say. But both this and other aspects of your research do tell us something about the subculture. And why don't you talk about what the most interesting things you found are?
Yeah, and I think that you raise an important point, which I mentioned intentionally several times, because in the course of doing my research and presenting on this, people were having trouble getting their heads around that. These are limited, and then not just my survey. The other surveys that have been done are very small sample size, and they're not random. So they don't tell us accurately at all, like what percentage of American Buddhists or American convert Buddhists practice some kind of, psychedelic Buddhism. So I think that's important to realize. At the same time, it's obvious that there are, people who do this, and I think that it really depends on I think this is part of the reason why I did those five life stories or narratives of psychedelic Buddhists to show that there's actually it's actually quite eclectic, and there's quite a wide range. One of the people is heavily involved in the Native American church, and also in Zen for many years, and he sees the two seamlessly kind of fitting together, what he describes as kind of left foot, right foot. Then there are other people who, one of the people that I talked about, he was a long-term Buddhist practitioner with no experience at all in psychedelics, and then later on, through his partner, discovered psychedelics. So I kind of inverted the model of that. Psychedelics turned me on to Buddhism, and then I became serious about my Buddhism.
In your experience, from your research, does it seem like it is more commonly the psychedelics that lead to the Buddhism than that the Buddhism leads to the psychedelics?
Well, interestingly, I think for baby boomers, it was definitely in that order,
Right.
right? It was definitely
60s
psychedelics
and
and
so on, yeah.
then Buddhism. Now it's not so clear. Generations X and Y. Um, sometimes it was Buddhism first, sometimes it's psychedelics first, and so it can go in almost any order. And also, I point out in the life narratives too that. At least two of the people who I describe as psychedelic Buddhists go long periods, many years, several years, sometimes a decade even, without using psychedelics at all, and then come back to them, and then they might leave them again for like another several years or a decade.
And they would continue to meditate during this period.
Yeah, the common denominator is that, I mean, the people that this was another issue. It's like, well, how do you define what a Buddhist is or who a Buddhist is, right? And so I basically fell back on the only valid choice that I could see was that if someone self-identifies as Buddhist, then I would, refer to them as a Buddhist. But I wanted to, I use a term, not strongly defining it, but I use a term of a serious Buddhist practitioner, and in my mind, basically, someone who's quite committed to a practice of meditation. So yeah, these are people who have pretty much, have daily practices, who've done extensive retreats. I mean, one of them did like a 3-year silent retreat in the Tibetan tradition.
That's a long one, 3 years.
Yeah, that's much more committed than me.
My record. Yeah.
So I think that's a common denominator is that they're committed to Buddhist practice, but the traditions might vary, and they might during the course of their own development move from first practicing Zen, then moving on more to Vipassana or insight, or trying out Tibetan Buddhism and then getting more interested in Zen. So, but the common denominator, I would say, is that they're committed to Buddhist practice, and they're also committed to certain, Buddhist values, what we call like compassion, loving kindness, equanimity, wisdom. They tend to frame their experiences in Buddhist terms. Mm-hmm. They're not like... they're not doing psychedelics, just for fun, or what Alan Watts called for kicks, right? Using a very 60s term, right? They're using it within a
Alan Watts was not himself disdainful of this, was he, or was he?
No, he wasn't at all. I mean, he wrote the book The Joyous Cosmology, which is around the same time as Leary and Alpert and Metzner wrote the psychedelic experience. So he was, he saw psychedelics as tools, but he's dismissive of using psychedelics recreationally. Mm-hmm. Like he sees that their appropriate context of psychedelic use is kind of spiritual. And I think one of the things, you asked right in the beginning, okay, well, what's happened since then? And I think this whole thing of what I call entheology, which really began in the late 70s into the 80s, that the idea that these substances, rather than calling them psychedelics, are entheogens, that they somehow engender the divine or can be used for spiritual purposes, was a kind of rebranding that sort of took place. And then also at the same time you have neo-shamanism happening, and with ayahuasca and new venues like Burning Man and psychedelic trance happen. And so there's this whole arc of development that's gone on since the 60s that kind of moves away from that kind of original cultural manifestation, I guess you could say. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I'm running off a tangent here, but
no, that's responsive. So I'm curious if you get any blowback from. I don't know if there's such a thing as a Buddhist establishment, like an American Buddhist establishment or Western Buddhist establishment. And of course, you make the point that a number of the kind of elders in the movement, the people who were, in their teens or in young adults in the 60s and early 70s, a number of them actually at that time did psychedelics, and some of them were introduced to Eastern thought via that avenue. But have you gotten any pushback from people who think that this kind of publicity taints? In other words, people who feel that actually the purer and more authentic conduit to these experiences is meditation and contemplation, and that chemicals, for one reason or another, kind of adulterate the experience or are less valid. Are there people in the Buddhism world who are kind of not enthusiastic about books like yours being written?
Well, I did. I have a short YouTube video where I talk about the book, and there was one negative comment there along those lines,
well,
that basically
there
these things
are always negative comments on the internet. That's not data.
I'm trying to come up with one, and so this was definitely one along what you just said, that these things have nothing to do with Buddhism. Just like a murderer, it has nothing. You can't be a mass murderer and be a Buddhist. Along those sort of lines, and that you're doing this just to make money, kind of thing. But I mean that's pretty much it. I mean, the thing is,
that's why people publish books with with university presses, right, to get rich.
Yeah, right. That's why I wrote this one. Yeah, because I'm gonna. Yeah. But and so I think, and this is what I think. One of the things I try to do in the book is I really try to champion, in some degree, subjectivity. Like I'm saying, we can't do studies, whether they're sociological or anthropological or whatever, and just erase the subject, right? And our subjectivity is really central to who we are and how we understand who we are, and so that's why I don't come down and say that this is legit Buddhism and this is not legit Buddhism, because whose Buddhism are we talking about here? I mean, I teach meditation. I'm not officially a part of any particular lineage, and I think that but there are traditions that I've done retreats on, and I like to do retreats with and things like that, and people that I personally consider to be my teachers. But I'm kind of a rogue teacher, I guess you could say, in that sense. But that also gives me liberty to actually speak my mind. Like I don't have to censure or audit my views based on what my lineage or what my teacher says. Obviously, there are going to be people who won't like the book, who'll disagree with the book. I tried to be, fairly even-handed through most of it, and with different views on the subject. I mean, some people are, I'll just give you one example. Is that I know that I think it's in Switzerland or something. There was going to be some pilot study where they wanted to use MDMA, ecstasy, like during a Zen session to see what kind of effect it would have. And for me, that really rubs me the wrong way, because I do sessions. I sit in I do the Zen week-long retreats, and I think that in those kind of contexts, those things shouldn't mix.
Right. You should control your variables, kind of, so to.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, when you're going to do Zen session, you should just do that. You shouldn't be mixing it with something else. If you want to do that in another context, do that. And so you could say, well, hey man, you're a psychedelic Buddhist, why don't, that just doesn't seem right to me. It really doesn't seem right to me. And I wouldn't recommend that people do that either. I mean, I always recommend to people that we're free agents. We should be able to do whatever we want with our own chemistry, but just be informed about what you're doing before you do it, and know what the risks are.
Okay. So along these lines, in terms of what kinds of things what versions of this might make you suspicious or worried, or kind of don't comport entirely with the way you would like to see psychedelic Buddhism approached? You know, we talked about people who would do, maybe they'd have a psychedelic experience and then go 10 years just meditating alone and then have another one and so on. So you can imagine all kinds of ratios. Do you get concerned if you encounter someone who has a very high psychedelic to meditation ratio? In other words, is there, you know, are you suspicious? Yeah. Maybe the question is, in the extreme case, would you worry about people who are trying to do it on psychedelics alone and doing psychedelics very frequently and saying, this is my spiritual practice, period? Like, have you seen that go awry, or do you have concerns about it, or do you think kind of any ratio can work?
Well, I mean, I guess it's up to individual. I mean, if someone was a friend of mine and was actually asking my opinion, I would say that you know, in these intense experiences, whether they're through meditation or through psychedelics, they need to be integrated into your psychology, into your everyday life, and that it's not hard, especially with things that are profoundly mind altering, to throw yourself off balance. You know, everybody has limit. You know, everybody has a limit. Everybody has a breaking point. You know, and I've seen it happen. And sometimes it's not. There's no such thing as a entirely benign substance, and there's no such thing as like 100% safe situation. I've seen some people, you know, depending on their set and setting, have a great time. Say on MDMA, and somebody else have a total panic reaction and have panic attacks for months afterwards. And so I would be worried about someone who I cared about if they were you know, taking very large doses, you know, continuously of substances, because it could very easily, you know, destabilize you. Psychologically. And some people are, you know, there's some people that are quite, you know, tough nuts, you know. And in my Vipassana study, where 40% had altered states of consciousness, that means 60% didn't. You know, they wouldn't even, you know, say they had unusual sensations. So it's hard to imagine someone doing 10 days of body scanning and not right. and not having at some point some kind of unusual sensation. But quite a few people said no, we didn't have that. So
and we should say that Vipassana that's an ancient term for insight. So it's a meditation tradition. That's actually the tradition I've done my practice in and my retreats in is Vipassana. Although the retreats you're talking about, the 10-day body scan retreats are just to demonstrate what a wide array of meditative traditions there are. The 10 days kind of body scan, those are in the Goenka tradition, I think, at particular retreat centers, and they're actually pretty different from the Vipassana retreats you would have at a place like Insight Meditation Society, which is another major retreat center in the United States. But so one you know, in the latter, the typical opening instruction is focus on your breath, and that kind of remains your anchor. Whereas the other in the Goenka tradition, there's a big emphasis on focusing on different parts of your body successively. They both fall within the Vipassana tradition and also kind of within the mindfulness tradition. But there's a lot of different traditions, and that leads me to a question I have for you. So you describe yourself as an eclectic Mahayana Buddhist, and we should say for people that the two basic branches of Buddhism are Theravada and Mahayana. Vipassana, which I just alluded to, is considered part of the Theravada branch. Mahayana and Theravada is largely confined to Southeast Asia in the Eastern Hemisphere. Mahayana includes, you know, things like Zen and Tibetan and so on. Well, but let me ask you, why, if you're eclectic, why do you call yourself Mahayana? In other words, what is it that's characteristic of a Mahayana perspective that you think applies to you that is a less central part of Theravada?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And I think it would be, two things. One is emptiness, and the other one is a bodhisattva path.
Okay, well, those are the two. I mean, and just by way of, again, by way of elaborating for lay people, I mean, the bodhisattva path is the idea that, well, I probably don't get it correctly, but it was an innovation in doctrine according to which the goal wasn't just to become enlightened and sit around and be enlightened, but even if you were capable of enlightenment, it might be a better idea to be active in the world and go around and teach and do all kinds of things, right? So it was a more, I don't know if missionary is the right word, but it was a less, maybe less monastic tradition. And then just quickly on emptiness, philosophically, that's the idea we alluded to, that things out there in the world don't have the kind of self-sufficient kind of substantive existence that you might intuit.
Yeah. That's, in a nutshell. I mean, this is what I do. This is what I do professionally. So I could go on for hours and hours about the difference between Theravada and Mahayana. But yeah, I think in a nutshell, those are the two main aspects of. And I've studied Mahayana and Mahayana Sutras for pretty much my entire adult life. Mm-hmm. I mean, one in particular, the Gandhavyuha Sutra, I've been studying for, since my early 20s. So,
and is that psychedelic?
People have said it was described as.
Does it describe visions and things, or what?
Yeah, it does. It uses it describes infinite Buddha lands that are jeweled, and Buddhas throughout all time and space, and interpenetration.
Is it big in the Tibetan tradition?
It has a fair place.
Yeah.
It has a fair place in the Tibetan tradition. It was a whole. It's it was also quite important in Chinese Huayan Buddhism. Mm-hmm. I don't know if you've heard of that, but there's a whole philosophical school of Chinese Buddhism. The Gandhavyuha is part of the Avatamsaka Sutra, or the flower ornament scripture, mm-hmm. and so there's an entire Chinese school developed around that called Huayan, which looks at tries to give a kind of philosophical account of what's happening in this kind of visionary experiences. So yeah, one of the things I talk about in my book is that I use this Lewis Williams, who's an anthropologist, has this kind of typology of altered states of consciousness, and he studied many, many different cultures throughout the world that practice various types of shamanism, and he noticed that there's certain different stages of inward consciousness, and one of the earliest stages is what he calls entoptic phenomena. So when people begin to see kind of geometrically repeating patterns and lights, and then the more as you progress further into this altered states, what happens is these geometric patterns take on particular forms based on one's culture. So the Huichol Indians, for example, will see deities from their pantheon, have visions of those. And basically the point that I make is that in these kind of Mahayana Sutras, where you have infinite Buddhas throughout all time and space, that they were altering their consciousness through intense meditation, so that they were having visionary experiences where you can map this kind of model onto of Buddhas throughout all time and space, and that kind of informed this kind of Mahayana vision of reality. And so these Mahayana Buddhists, they weren't taking LSD or mushrooms, but they were practicing intense meditation, and through that intense meditation and interpreting it in a particular way had a lot to do with why there was Mahayana Buddhism. Mm-hmm. Actually, I have an article coming out. It'll be coming out next year, in a book on early Mahayana, just about this topic. It's on early Mahayana.
But is it an argument about Mahayana. What kinds of meditative experiences gave rise to the distinctive Mahayana branch, or what?
Yeah, it talks a bit about that, and it talks about the kind of context for the emergence of Mahayana Sutras and this new vision of Buddhas throughout all time and space, and it relates that to altered states of consciousness. I mean, there was probably some visualization that was going on of the Buddha that had something to do with this too. So
did this become a big part of Mahayana doctrine, the idea of like bunches of Buddhas as opposed to...
yeah, absolutely.
So,
it was core.
was the idea that this was not the first Buddha, is that distinctive of Mahayana? That's not part of Theravada? Or
No, what you find in Theravada is that there's an infinite amount of Buddhas sequentially, but there's only one Buddha at a time.
I see.
So the Shakyamuni Buddha or Siddhartha Gautama was just one Buddha of an infinite series, and the idea, and Maitreya will be, or Maitreya will be the next Buddha, and as time went on, they got more elaborate in naming previous Buddhas and future Buddhas, but they're only in Theravada, and it seems in early Buddhism also, there's only one Buddha at a time.
Yeah.
And in Mahayana, what happens is you have infinite amounts of Buddhas that are all time and space. And that had a lot to do with the idea of the Bodhisattva path, and it had a lot to do with the development of Pure Land schools, because if you have, say, Amida Buddha or in the Western paradise, you can have faith in him and get reborn in his Pure Land. And so all these other Buddhas throughout time and space become means of directly accessing that enlightened wisdom of a Buddha right here and now. As opposed to, because from a kind of Theravada worldview, we're sort of stuck in between Buddhas. So we kind of basically have to follow the teachings of Shakyamuni or Siddhartha Gautama until the next Buddha arrives.
So salvation becomes more accessible for the individual, and that's maybe especially true in Pure Land, or... I don't want to get too deeply into the weeds here.
Yeah,
let me ask you.
No, but I think that's been one way. Yeah.
But let me ask you one more question, though, picking up on that before I ask you the final question. And this, the penultimate question is: what exactly is the connection you're seeing between multiple Buddhas at one time and the Bodhisattva path? Are you saying that this vision of lots of Buddhas around at once somehow leads people to the idea of the Bodhisattva, this person who's kind of maybe on the brink of enlightenment and chooses to kind of stay very much in the world and engage, so to speak?
Yeah, well, all right. How do I do this briefly? In Theravada Buddhism, say, and what we also find in early Buddhism is that there's a very sharp distinction between samsara and nirvana. And one of the most important things about nirvana is the end of rebirth.
Mm-hmm. Samsara is the cycle.
A cycle of death and rebirth of suffering that we're all sort of in. And so when someone attains nirvana, it is the end of rebirth, and they pass completely beyond samsara. That's it. They're gone. Now with Mahayana, that distinction between samsara and nirvana no longer pertains. That when you get Nagarjuna and the Madhyamaka school, so there's no difference between samsara and nirvana, right? So the goal then shifts between escaping samsara to becoming a completely and fully enlightened Buddha. Mm-hmm. Now, in the early Buddhism and in Theravada Buddhism, the Buddha and the enlightened saint have both attained nirvana, and they both escape from the cycle of samsara. But in Mahayana, there's an idea that to be a fully, completely enlightened Buddha means to be omniscient, and to actually become one with all time and space. Mm. So the goal then becomes complete, full Buddhahood rather than nirvana per se. And with Buddhas existing throughout all time and space, one then through visionary experience, what they understood as samadhi, which is a special type of kind of trance or visionary experience, you could directly access other Buddhas and hear their teachings and then progress onto this path to complete Buddhahood. And so either the enlightenment of the early Buddhism in Theravada was seen as kind of just a lesser stage, or was seen as a kind of, almost as a sort of a pseudo enlightenment, or not full enlightenment, because the goal then becomes omniscient Buddhahood rather than just trying to escape from samsara, escape from the cycle. And I think in that sense, it kind of opens up Buddhism to there's a lot of different ways to arrive at that ultimate goal, and it sort of decenters this kind of monastic view that you really need to renounce the world in order to become enlightened. So, I mean, yeah, in a nutshell, I think those are some pretty, significant differences. And I think that's one of the things that's obscured in the modern practice of insight, is that Theravada Buddhism very much is about renouncing the world. It's not about better living in samsara. I mean, there's two tiers in Theravada Buddhism. One of them is you get good karma and you have a better rebirth, and that's what lay people are supposed to do. Monastics, and not many of them live up to this ideal, but there's supposedly an elite core of monastics that are striving to attain nirvana. And so if you're really after nirvana, then you need to renounce the world. It's not about better living in samsara. It's not about being happier, healthier, well-adjusted,
although
less
I
stressful.
think isn't there kind of the idea that the renunciation, as austere as it sounds, does lead to bliss, right? I mean, the disengagement from all of your thirsts does make you happier, but you're right that it's not, renunciation isn't especially emphasized in the average Vipassana retreat center.
No,
although
it's
I mean,
not.
look, a modest amount of it is emphasized, but I take your point. So the final question is just about the title of the book, Altered States, and again the subtitle is Buddhism and Psychedelic Spirituality in America, from Columbia University Press. Is that phrase, altered states, does that come from William James originally, or am I misremembering that?
I don't know. I mean, William James definitely did talk about different states of consciousness.
There's some passage where he emphasizes that ordinary consciousness that we take for granted as like the real consciousness is one of many possible consciousnesses, and that you could in principle slip into, and kind of, who's to say which is more valid. But I may be totally wrong. He may not have used the phrase altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he did, but he experimented with nitrous oxide, and that was his kind of window into the fact that it's like our ordinary everyday consciousness is kind of like one frequency, or one station in a radio, and so that there's a wide spectrum of possibilities within consciousness, and that's kind of what he was interested in, and unsurprisingly, people like Timothy Leary will reference William James about this kind of different states of consciousness. I'm not sure who originally coined the term altered states. Altered states actually wasn't the original idea for the title of the book. It was at the suggestion of the publisher, because there's a movie, Altered States, and there's about another dozen books entitled Altered States.
What title were you thinking of?
I hadn't come up. I mean, I was thinking something, just what was the subtitle, just Buddhism and Psychedelic Spirituality in America. But I guess with Altered States, you have the obvious pun there that it's the United States of America, and so it's being altered, our states, by these two different types of spirituality, and I think that it's important to realize that it is a study in a way about American Buddhism. Being an expat for the last 16 years, you kind of get a bit of a different perspective. And for me, having been born and raised in America, I guess I have some kind of there's some kind of nostalgia for the United States, and there was a desire to really kind of explore what was going on in American Buddhism. So, and I think that sometimes people forget that in the States that there is a big wide world out there outside of America, and so I think that being specific about my field there is part of what I was trying to do in the book. It's like, okay, what's really going on? And I've been accused. I mean, there's a review that came out recently where someone basically referred to my methodology as I don't know, called methodological liberalism, and this kind of inherent sort of elitism that goes along kind of with that. And I tried to be as upfront as I could about the idea that, I mean, basically, psychedelic Buddhism is a kind of elite spirituality in the sense that, you know, convert American Buddhists are white, are middle class, are upper middle class. They're well educated. The psychedelic variety tends to be more widely represented in males. And I'm in that demographic, but I don't think that just that fact delegitimizes the type of spirituality.
I mean, any
but also
subculture you study is going to be a particular demographic, and I mean, so if all the subcultures are going to be studied, there are going to be studies of relatively elite populations. I mean, I mean, I haven't seen the review. I don't know what exactly the criticism was, but you know, but anyway. That would be my reaction.
Yeah, and I think that it doesn't. I mean, it's influence. I think the numbers are actually quite small, but because of that kind of elitism that's involved, those small numbers can be quite influential. I mean, American Buddhism too. It might be now up to maybe 1% of the population in the United States are Buddhist, but it's a pretty influential 1% because of that fact that they're well educated and are often well off. So I think that by itself doesn't delegitimize it as an object of study, but I think it needs to be recognized anyway. So
sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and it's a very interesting book. Good luck with it. And maybe down the road we'll check in with you again, see how things are going.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
I enjoyed it.
Okay, take care.